It's a pleasure for me that I have been given this opportunity to speak to you basically about the new economic policy, new education policy. You see, 1930, when Gandhiji was launching his civil disobedience movement, he actually asked students to leave their colleges and universities and to join the movement. Now, at that point, Rabindranath Tagore, the poet, wrote to him saying, how can you ask people to give up their education? Because after all, there are so few educated people in the country. And if those who are getting education are asked to give it up, in that case, the country would be ill-served. It's better for the country that these people should continue in the places where they are getting some education. Which Gandhiji's reply was that, look, the education that they are getting is not the education that the country needs. In other words, Gandhiji was making a very important distinction between education and education. The fact that education is not a homogeneous thing to which you can give to somebody, or which you may withhold from somebody, that education as a homogeneous entity, a homogeneous quantity to which more or less is given to somebody. This is what Gandhiji was actually challenging. The idea, in other words, is that there is no such homogeneous thing called education, that education is something which depends upon, or what is relevant education, what is useful education, is something which is not independent of the context where this education is being given. Now, I think that's very important, because his idea was that the Indian nation in the making, that basically you have education that is required for the making of this nation, for nation building. Now, that education is quite different from the education that people get
Hello,
for getting their jobs.
hello.
Yes, yes. Okay. So, therefore, the idea was that education required for the purpose of nation building is not exactly the same as education that is required, let us say, for you're getting a job. They are not identical entities. Now, this idea of a non-homogeneousness of education, education that is relevant depending on the context that we are talking about, is something which is diametrically opposed to the idea of education under capitalism. In capitalism, you have for the first time the formation of a labor market. That means you may be here today, you may be hundreds of miles away somewhere else, you may be a skilled labor, you may be an unskilled laborer, whatever, you move around a lot. Capitalism is based on labor mobility. Labor mobility implies the coming into being of a labor market. And if this labor market is to be meaningful, then everybody who's moving around, people who are separated by hundreds of miles, must actually have the same kinds of knowledge, same kinds of skills, same kinds of attitudes. Therefore, capitalism requires education that is homogeneous. It's very important that what is being taught here and what is being taught 500 miles away, 2,000 miles away, or even 6,000 miles away must be identical, in which case a person from here can go tomorrow to the United States and fit into a job there. So the formation of a labor market requires a kind of homogeneity as far as education is concerned. So homogeneity becomes important with the coming into being of capitalism. The point, therefore, I'm trying to make is that the education which is required for nation building and the education that is given or demanded by capitalism are not identical things. Now, in India, in the post independence period, we have always, no matter what our problems were, no matter what the problems with the education system were, we were always committed to a vision of education for nation building, which showed itself in a number of ways. First, it showed itself in the commitment to the idea of universal education, at least up to a certain level. When, for instance, the Right to Education Act was passed, that Right to Education Act provided that everybody must have the right to education between the ages of 6 and 14. That means that you had universal, and to the government's job to ensure that everybody in that age was actually in a school. Therefore, universalizing education was a part of the requirement of education for nation. The second was, of course, when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to the syllabus. Imagine, for instance, an Indian student who's studying, let's say, economics, which is my subject. Such an Indian student must have some idea of Indian history. How can you understand the Indian economy today unless you know something about the Indian economy in the colonial period, unless you have some idea of the impact of colonialism on the Indian economy? But on the other hand, a person who is studying economics in Harvard or in Cambridge or in Oxford has no idea of colonialism, doesn't have to study colonialism. Therefore, the kind of syllabus which has to be taught here has to be quite different from the kind of syllabus which prevails in foreign universities. Mind you, this is true not only of social sciences. The great British scientist J.D. Bernal was of the view that the kind of science which should be taught in a country like India should not be the same as the science that is taught in a country like Britain or the United States, because the scientific requirements of the Indian society are not identical with the scientific requirements of those societies. Therefore, there has to be a difference in syllabus. Likewise, there has to be inclusiveness, that that you have to have everybody, no matter what their economic status, who is covered by education, which is already implicit in the idea of a universal education. But that fundamentally, for instance, a Dalit boy, a person from a tribal background, a person from the OBC background, a person who is economically deprived should not be deprived of education for that particular reason. Because of which we had a number of things. We had, for instance, affirmative action in the form of reservations for specific categories of castes and so on. So we had and inclusiveness, which was a part of the vision of education for building a nation. Likewise, for instance, the idea that persons who are getting educated must have an idea of the constitution, must education must impart a commitment to the values on which modern India is based, which are the constitutional values, and an egalitarian society, a society which is secular, a society in which everybody has a set of fundamental rights. Now, all these things must be told to every student, and the student must develop a kind of commitment to the society and the values upon which that society is founded. Additionally, of course, is the whole question of education providing in your mind a stimulus to question. Now that is very important. That education must make you question things, not accept things uncritically, but to actually question, to develop a scientific temper, and so on. Now these are the hallmarks of an education system which is required for nation building. Sensitivity to others, a commitment to equality, and overcoming of caste and communal divide, and so on. All these are essential for building a nation, since education is a means through which the nation is built. It is important that education must impart these values. But on the other hand, what we find in the current new education policy is that for the first time, earlier education policies, even though they may be saying various things, it is true that actually the quality of education given was no good. It is true that our vision behind the education policy was always violated by the empirical reality of the education system, and so on. All that is true. But nonetheless, there was a commitment to education as a nation building activity. There was a commitment of education in the sense of being inclusive and in the sense of being egalitarian, in the sense of, not excluding anybody, and inculcating in the students commitment to the values of the Constitution. What we find in the current education policy for the first time is a moving away from the concept of education as a nation building exercise, as a nation building activity, but in fact, specifically looking at education as an activity for the promotion of capitalism. Now, why do I say that? I say that because look at a number of things. First point is that it actually explicitly provides for exclusion. Throughout the document, there is some talk about economically and socially deprived groups, but there is no explicit commitment to caste-based reservations in universities and colleges. There is no mention of it. Okay. Now, I think, given the fact that even in a university like the JNU, caste-based reservation criteria have been violated and flouted, and JNU is directly under the nose of the central government, the fact that the government's commitment to such reservations has got diluted is without a doubt, and the fact that the education policy document doesn't even mention it is a point of some significance. Not only is it the case that, therefore, people would be excluded who come from socially and economically deprived backgrounds because there'd be no reservation, but what is more, you would actually find that because education is all set to become more expensive, many people would simply economically be cut out of it. Why do I say that? Because even though the document talks about 6% of GDP being spent on education and so on, that government expenditure devoted to education must rise from 10% to 20%, there is no specific suggestions about how this is going to be actually achieved. In the absence of any specific suggestions of that kind, simply repeating this really does not make much sense. On the other hand, there is talk about, for instance, giving autonomy to colleges and universities, and what is more, financial autonomy as well. Now, autonomous colleges and so on, which are actually therefore have to more or less fend for themselves, would be charging much higher fees. And when they do that, then of course, these exclude large numbers of relatively poor students from socially and economically deprived backgrounds. Therefore, even in terms of the education system that is visualized, there is going to be an exclusion. Thirdly, you actually find that there are large numbers of exit points. That, for instance, you look at university education, after 1 year, you can quit. After 2 years, you can quit. You get a certificate and you quit. You have a 4-year undergraduate program in colleges. And out of those 4 years, you can quit after first year, you can quit after second year and get a piece of paper. Now, it is not a 1-year program that is being offered. It is not a 2-year program that is being offered. It's a 4-year program, and you're simply going to drop out at some point if you so wish. Therefore, this provides the possibility of people simply dropping out, and when they drop out, they're given a piece of paper, and that piece of paper we call a certificate or we call a diploma and so on. So effectively, therefore, the idea is to visualize a set of people who would be barely educated, who would just have visited a college or a university, but not people who are actually being trained or who are being given a proper course of education. Now, these exit points are basically, I mean, somebody may not have joined the university, but somebody joins the university, but then leaves after a year with a piece of paper. So these are, if you like, in the name of flexibility, providing a camouflage, providing a kind of cover for just people dropping out. The fourth is something which you find in the emphasis that is given to vocational studies. A lot of talk about vocational studies. Now, of course, it is true that not everybody who receives education should go on to do a PhD or something and become a professor in a university. But on the other hand, everybody must have a minimum level of education.